The Victorians were fussy eaters. They had bizarre food rules and were generally pretty rude about food. Here are some surprising facts about what the Victorians ate and how they ate it. Fact number 1. They had very specific rules about eating with the correct silverware. The Victorians had a very specific set of rules for which plate and silverware to use when dining. This depended on the type of meal being served. For example, there was an elaborate hierarchy of plates and platters that were used, depending on the main dish. Some examples include entree plates, side plates, salad plates, bread and butter plates, fruit plates, and pudding plates. This wasn't even the most complicated part of it, though, because each one of these could be made from either ironstone, which was the cheapest option, or porcelain, which was the most expensive. Then you had your knives, forks, and spoons, which all had specific functions and specific placements on the table. This was important not only to show off your wealth, but also to avoid any cross-contamination between meat and non-meat courses. To make matters even more complicated, the correct placement of the utensils would change depending on whether or not you were serving right-handed people or left-handed people. If you were hosting a dinner party, you needed to keep track of not only what each utensil was for, but where each person should be sitting in order to have perfect etiquette. There were even special books published with illustrations showing the correct place settings for different types of meals. It's no wonder that people were so obsessed with having the right silverware. Fact 2. Etiquette dictated that you must eat with your fingers when eating bread, despite the fact that forks were invented over 4,000 years ago. For a long time, eating with your hands was considered to be the height of elegance, and this was especially true when it came to eating bread. It wasn't necessarily poor people who ate with their hands. In fact, many wealthy people preferred to eat bread with their fingers instead of a knife and fork. There was even a saying, "The hand is quicker than the eye," that described the speed and dexterity required to eat bread properly. According to etiquette books, it was considered quite uncouth to tear the bread apart with your fingers, so it was best to simply hold the bread in your hand and bite into it. It was also not proper to cut the bread with a knife, as this was seen as being too much effort. Instead, the correct way to cut your bread was to simply break it apart with your fingers. As you can imagine, this could get pretty messy, and there were strict rules about how to avoid getting crumbs on your clothes. You could only wipe crumbs off your clothes onto your plate, never your napkin, and you must always finish all the pieces of bread on your plate. It was considered extremely impolite to leave any bread behind, as this implied that you thought the cook had wasted their time and effort. If you couldn't finish all the bread on your plate, you should have asked for a doggy bag to take it home. But even then, you weren't supposed to take it home for yourself. The bread was supposed to be given to the servants to eat. Fact 3. Etiquette books weren't sure how soup should be eaten, as you might expect. There were plenty of rules about how to eat soup. After all, soup is basically liquid, and liquids were seen as being inherently more messy than solid foods. For example, the spoon you ate your soup with had to be small enough that you didn't accidentally splash any soup out when you lifted it to your mouth. This was especially true for women. A woman's soup spoon had to be even smaller than a man's soup spoon, because it was assumed that they had less control over their arms and wrists. But despite the fact that these rules were supposedly about being polite, many etiquette books actually seemed to be worried about soup splashing more than anything else. In fact, one book gave detailed instructions on how to slurp your soup in order to prevent it from spilling. But then other books would go on and on about how noisy slurping was, and that you shouldn't do it. So it seems that the Victorians just couldn't decide whether or not soup slurping was acceptable or not. Maybe if they'd invented the spoon rest, it wouldn't have been such a problem. Fact 4. They were obsessed with avoiding contamination. Although we now know that germs cause disease, at the time of the Victorians, people had no idea why people got sick. However, they did notice that sometimes people would get sick after eating certain foods, and so they began to develop rules around food contamination. One of the biggest worries at the time was the idea of meat poisoning. This was supposedly caused by eating meat that had been cooked improperly and left over from the previous night, and it was said to cause stomach aches, vomiting, and even death. Because of this, there was an unspoken rule that you never left meat on your plate after a meal. It was always finished, and if you couldn't finish it, it meant that you had failed as a person. People were so worried about meat poisoning that they also began to think that eating leftovers of any kind was dangerous. Because of this, there was also a class system that developed around food. If you were higher on the social rungs, you were more likely to throw away leftover food rather than serve it to guests. If you were lower on the social rungs, you were more likely to serve leftovers to guests, both because you had to save money and because it was expected that you would. Fact 5. Their most popular dessert was eggs. It might seem strange today, but in the Victorian era, eggs were one of the most popular desserts around. The most common way to prepare them was to simply whip the egg whites until they were stiff and fluffy, and then add sugar and vanilla to make it taste better. Sometimes they would also add a little bit of egg yolk to give it a richer flavor. Once it was done, the mixture would be poured into a mold and then allowed to set up overnight. The next day, it would be flipped out onto a plate and served to guests. Another popular way to serve eggs as dessert was to fry them in a little bit of butter and then sprinkle them with sugar. This might sound disgusting to us now, but apparently it was quite delicious, and it's still a popular dish in some parts of Europe. It turns out that these sweet egg dishes were popular because eggs were seen as a symbol of fertility and new life. This was especially true during the Easter holiday, when eggs were decorated with bright colors and patterns so that they could be given as gifts to friends and family. Fact 6. Dinner was always served at gunpoint. It might seem odd to us today, but back in the Victorian era, it was very common for people to carry guns around with them. After all, back then, people didn't have things like self-defense classes or pepper spray to protect themselves. So if someone wanted to defend themselves, they needed something a little more heavy-duty. Because of this, it was very common for people to be carrying guns when they went out to dinner. Sometimes the waiter would even help them with this. For example, in New Orleans, it was common for waiters to help patrons hang their guns on hooks located under the tables. This was so that they wouldn't accidentally bump into them and shoot themselves. Of course, this led to its fair share of accidents, but it was considered to be a necessary evil. It was also common for people to carry guns while they were eating dinner. In fact, many restaurants would have a gun rack near the door so that people could store their guns while they were eating. This way, they wouldn't accidentally shoot themselves while they were trying to eat their food. It was also considered to be a sign of masculinity and power. In fact, there were even etiquette books at the time that told men how to properly handle their guns while they were eating. Apparently, you needed to keep your finger on the trigger at all times, just in case. Now it's time to hear from you. What surprised you the most about Victorian food and dining habits? Let me know in the comments below. And before you go, make sure you subscribe so you can catch our latest content.